The sea was black long before the shooting started, not just dark. Black in the way only the mid-Atlantic can be at 2:30 in the morning, 1,000 miles from land under a sky smothered in thick winter cloud. No moon, no stars, no shoreline lights. Just wind and water and the occasional stab of white foam when a wave top sheared off and rolled away. Somewhere in that blackness, 40 merchant ships creaked and groaned their way westward in loose columns, bow waves punching into the swell, stacks blowing faint red sparks into the night. If you'd flown over them with a camera that could see in the dark, you'd have seen a ragged grid of hulls stretching out in rows. Tankers, freighters, tramp steamers with chipped paint and names worn half off their bows. Around them, like sheepdogs around a flock, a handful of smaller shapes, the escorts. A British destroyer at the head slicing spray. 2 corvettes on the flanks, their stubby bows burying into waves and tossing spray high. A trawler at the rear converted from a fishing boat into a warship with the addition of a gun, some depth charges, and a crew that still smelled faintly of diesel and fish. They called this convoy On 207 in the logs or something like that. The exact number didn't matter to most of the men aboard. For them it was just the convoy. Another slow, dangerous crossing from Britain to the United States and Canada, carrying grain, fuel, munitions, and every other kind of cargo a country at war needed. The convoy system was supposed to be their protection. Many ships together, guarded by warships, watched by lookout eyes and primitive radar and Aztec sonar. What none of them could see on that black Atlantic night were the 6 gray wolves that had already smelled them. 6 U-boats tracking on the surface, their diesel engines rumbling low, their narrow bows slicing through the same black water, closing in from different angles. The men aboard those submarines were not looking at a nameless convoy. They were looking at a prize. On the bridge of the destroyer, HMS Ardent, Lieutenant Commander James Carr wiped salt spray from his face with a stiff glove and squinted into the darkness. The ship knifed forward at 15 knots, bow rising and falling, spray blowing back over the forecastle. Below, in the warm guts of the ship, men dozed in hammocks or sweated in engine rooms. Up here it was just Carr, the officer of the watch, the helmsman, a signalman, and the lookouts. Dark shapes in duffel coats and life jackets, faces pale in the faint glow from the compass binnacle. "Any sign on radar?" Carr called toward the hooded shape of the radar set under its canvas screen. The operator shook his head, eyes on the flickering green tube. "Nothing but the merchantman, sir. Same as before. Sea clutter's bad." Carr grunted. Radar was still a young beast in this war, useful but moody. In rough seas, the echoes from wave tops could smear over faint contacts. A skilled operator could sometimes tease out a blip that didn't look like a wave, but there was no guarantee. "Very well. Keep sweeping. If you see even a ghost out there, I want to know." He turned back to the dark. It was always like this, he thought. The worst part was the waiting. In daylight, at least you could see the horizon, see if anything unusual broke the clean line where sky met sea. At night, especially a night like this, you could feel like the only ship left on the planet, alone and blind. And yet somewhere out there, he knew the U-boats were hunting. "They'll be here," his captain had said hours earlier down in the wardroom over a lukewarm mug of tea. The aircraft lost contact near dusk. A wolfpack was shadowing us from the east. Once it's dark, they'll try to get in. Carr had nodded. They all knew the routine now. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned into a brutal chess game. Convoys zigzagged, changed course at prearranged times, and sailed under escort bubbles of aircraft whenever they were near land. U-boats formed wolfpacks, lines of submarines strung out across likely shipping routes. When one boat found a convoy, it shadowed it and called the pack in by radio. Then, usually under the cover of darkness, they attacked on the surface, where their diesels gave them more speed and agility than underwater. Surface attacks were the real nightmare. Underwater, a U-boat was a slow, half-blind creature, good at hiding but clumsy at chasing. On the surface at night, it was a low, fast, hard-to-spot shark. Carr scanned the dark again and told himself the same lie every escort officer told himself on nights like this. If they come, we'll see them in time. On one of those low-gray sharks, Oberleutnant zur See Karl Voss stood on the tiny bridge of U-117, collar turned up against the spray, and smiled into the wind. For him, this was not a landless, featureless night. It was rich with information. The wind came from the northwest, a steady force 5, raising moderate seas, perfect for covering approach noise. Too rough for fragile coastal craft, but not yet bad enough to keep a Type 7 U-boat from making good speed on the surface. The air tasted of salt and tar and cold iron. Hours earlier, his radio man had picked up a burst transmission from another boat in the group. Contact with a large convoy, course west by southwest, speed 7 knots. Since then, they had been closing in. He lifted his U-boat commander's binoculars, long, heavy with wide lenses, and swept them across the blackness. To an untrained eye, there was nothing. But Voss knew how to read night at sea. There, a faint smudge of lighter gray where darkness met darkness low on the horizon. And there, a pinprick of orange as some careless merchant sailor opened a door, light leaking through before it slammed shut again. He checked his watch. "Time to attack," he said softly. His first watch officer, a lanky Saxon with a scarf wrapped high around his face, nodded. Below them, the bridge fairing shook with the rumble of the diesels throttled back to half. Voss turned to the helmsman at the bridge wheel. "Come left 2 points. Bring us to 090. We'll cross ahead of their track and then cut in between the columns." He could picture the convoy in his mind. Columns of ships like streets in a dark city, moving slowly across the sea. The escorts would be on the outside edges, eyes straining outward into the dark. Inside, between the columns, there would be gaps, dark alleys just wide enough for a skilled U-boat commander to slink down and pick his victim. That was the trick of a night surface attack. You didn't smash against the wall. You slipped through the gate. In the mid-Atlantic night, time stretched and folded. On the Norwegian tanker Skagerrak, able seaman Tom Riley stamped his feet on the steel deck and cursed the cold. He had been born in London, had signed on to the merchant navy at 18, and still couldn't quite believe he was out here, halfway to nowhere, guarding a ship full of oil with nothing but his eyes and a battered pair of binoculars. He swung them slowly from port to starboard, scanning the black waves. Behind him, the bulk of the tanker rose like a dark cliff, deck cluttered with pipes and vents. Forward, he could just make out the silhouettes of the ships ahead in his column. A freighter with a crane amidships, a smaller coastal ship riding higher in the water. Every now and then, a voice drifted up from the bridge, faint over the wind. Someone laughed at a joke. Someone else yawned. Riley tried not to think about the stories he'd heard. Convoys hit by wolfpacks, 20 ships sunk in one night, men clinging to rafts in icy seas, screaming as oil burned across the surface. U-boats surfacing among lifeboats with their decks slick with oil and blood. He swallowed. "See anything?" a voice asked behind him. He turned to see Joe, another seaman, clamber up the ladder with a mug of something hot. "Nothing," Riley said, "just black on black." Joe handed him the mug. "Here, tea, or what passes for it. Captain says we're nearly through the worst of it. Maybe the Krauts missed us this time." Riley raised the mug, grateful for the heat, and tried to believe it. Far away, unseen by both of them, 6 U-boat captains were proving that hope wrong. The first indication the convoy had that hell was about to begin was a shout from a lookout on the starboard wing of the destroyer's bridge. Light bearing green 1-5, low on the water, sir. Looks like a bow wave. Carr snapped his head around. Where? The lookout jabbed his finger into the dark. There, sir. 2 points off. Something's moving. Carr snatched up his binoculars and followed the line of the man's arm. At first, nothing. His heart pounded. Come on, you bastard, show yourself. Then he saw it. Not a ship. Not yet. But a smear of brightness, where no brightness should be, low and sharp, cutting across the waves. The faint ghostly V of a bow wave lit from behind by the convoy's own dim hooded lights. A U-boat on the surface charging in. Hard a starboard, he barked. Sound action stations, starboard Oerlikon, stand by. He grabbed the voice pipe to the captain's cabin. Captain, sir, surface contact close on starboard bow. U-boat inside the screen. The ship's siren began to howl, a long rising wail that cut through every compartment. Men tumbled out of hammocks, boots slamming onto steel, claxons clanging. Gun crews sprinted to positions, slamming home magazines and slewing barrels. For a few seconds, the convoy was still moving as it had before, blind and slow. Then all at once, the night exploded. On U-117, Voss saw the destroyer turn and cursed under his breath. They've seen us, but he had already committed. He gripped the rail of the bridge tight as the bow rode up and then slammed down into a wave, spray smashing over the conning tower. Flank speed, he shouted down the hatch. All ahead full. The diesels roared louder. U-117 surged forward, heading straight toward the dark mass of the convoy. Targets, he snapped to his first watch officer. Pick me targets. The young officer lifted his own binoculars and squinted. There, Herr Kalayun, large tanker in the second column. And behind it, a freighter loaded low. Good prizes. Voss nodded. Tankers were liquid gold. Oil kept navies and air forces alive. Sinking one tanker did more damage to the enemy's war effort than sinking 3 half-empty freighters. He glanced back over his shoulder toward where he knew his fellow U-boats were stalking in the dark. They were there, scattered across a wide arc, 6 of them, including his own, all converging. He had spoken to some of their captains briefly over the radio earlier, using terse, coded messages to coordinate approach. Now there would be no radio. From here on, it was knives in the dark. He turned back to the bow. Ready torpedo tubes 1 through 4, he said calmly. Set depth to 2 meters. Impact pistols. We will fire fan spread. Aye, Herr Kalayun. Inside the pressure hull, torpedo men swung heavy levers, spun dials, checked pressure gauges. Torpedoes waited in their tubes, 4 long steel fish, their warheads filled with hundreds of kilos of explosive. Lines of sweat trickled down faces in the cramped, warm air despite the cold outside. On the bridge, Voss watched the target grow. At first, just a darker shape, then a bow, a forecastle, the faint suggestion of a bridge. Range, 800 meters, 700. He made a tiny adjustment to course. Steady, he murmured. On the Skagerrak, able seaman Riley spilled half his tea as the siren wailed. What the? U-boat! Joe shouted, pointing wildly. There! Christ, it's charging right at us! Riley spun, heart in his throat. For a split second, he saw it. Something low and dark and wrong on the waterline, slicing between the columns, a foaming wake streaming from its bow. Then the tanker's foghorn bellowed and the helmsman spun the wheel, and the deck beneath his feet heeled over sharply to port. Hold on! Someone yelled. The ship groaned as she turned, her massive inertia fighting the sudden change. Cargo sloshed in her tanks. Men staggered and grabbed for rails. Somewhere aft, the crackle of machine gun fire began as gunners opened up blindly into the night, tracer arcs stitching across the waves. The convoy's neat columns dissolved into chaos. Ships turned at different speeds, some following the escort's pre-arranged emergency turn signal, others reacting late or not at all. The neat, predictable grid that had seemed so solid an hour earlier was breaking apart like a dropped plate. In that chaos, the U-boats saw opportunity. Fire! On the bridge of U-117, Voss gave the order and the boat shuddered as torpedo tube 1 expelled its weapon. 2 seconds later, Fire 2! Another kick, another torpedo roaring out into cold seawater. Fire 3! Fire 4! Inside the hull, compressed air blasted the torpedoes into the night. Outside, they shot from their tubes in brief white bursts of bubbles, then settled into their running depth, propellers whirring, tracks invisible in the dark. Voss counted under his breath. Torpedoes had to travel the distance between his boat and the target. Each one took dozens of seconds, depending on range and speed. In those seconds, any number of things could ruin the shot. The target could turn, the torpedo could malfunction, the pistol could fail to detonate. Every U-boat commander knew the horror of duds. Voss clenched his jaw and stared at the tanker, now swinging slightly as she tried to respond to the alarm. "Come on," he whispered. "Just a little closer, just a little truer." 30 seconds, 35, 40. He saw the first hit before he heard it. A bright, hard blossom of orange and white punched out of the tanker's flank amidships, throwing metal and oil into the air. A heartbeat later, the sound reached them, a flat, stunning crack thump that rolled across the water, followed by a deeper, longer roar as the fuel ignited. The Skagerrak's deck leaped under Riley's feet. He was thrown backward, the world turning into fire and noise. To the men on the escort ships, the first explosion was like a flash of day in the night. Carr shielded his eyes and swore as a flower of fire climbed into the sky from the heart of the convoy. The tanker's silhouette was briefly stark against the blaze, then dissolved as pieces of steel and burning fuel tore away. "God Almighty," someone whispered behind him. The destroyer's captain burst onto the bridge, half-dressed, pulling on a coat. "Report!" "U-boat inside the screen, sir," Carr snapped. "Tanker hit amidships. Looks like a secondary's going off. Multiple torpedoes in the water. Convoy is turning, but there's chaos." The captain's jaw tightened. "Bring us toward the explosion. If there's one, there'll be more. Pass the word. All escorts to close attack positions. Tell the corvettes to fan out. We'll drive them under." But even as the destroyer swung toward the doomed tanker, more flashes bloomed. A second U-boat, attacking from the opposite side, had found its own targets, a freighter and a tramp steamer, hit in quick succession. The freighter took one torpedo forward and began to sag at the bow, its stern rising as seawater poured in. The tramp steamer tried to turn away and took a torpedo under the engine room, her lights flickering as generators failed. In less than 2 minutes, 3 ships were fatally wounded. The night was no longer black. It was lit by 3 growing pillars of orange flame, reflections writhing on the waves like molten metal. For the U-boat captains, this was the moment of greatest danger and greatest reward. On U-117, Voss watched the tanker burn. Flames raced across the surface of the spilled oil, turning the sea into a writhing, flickering floor of fire. Men flung themselves from the decks, some immediately engulfed as they hit the burning slick. Others scrambled for lifeboats, which swung drunkenly out and slammed into the hull in the rush. He felt a brief, sharp satisfaction. Target destroyed, but he didn't have time to linger. "Hard to port," he snapped. "We're going between the columns. We have more fish to shoot." He could already see the destroyer charging in, bow cutting through the dim glow. Soon depth charges would fall. He had to slip away. Behind him, another U-boat, U-99, was taking a different risk. Its commander, a more aggressive man with less patience, had decided to press in close, almost into the convoy's center before firing. In the flickering light of the burning tanker, he could see ships silhouetted like buildings in a city on fire. He picked a cargo ship riding low in the water, probably loaded with ammunition, and fired 2 torpedoes at near point-blank range. Both hit. The explosion that followed was like a small sun being born. A white flash washed over the scene, followed by a concussive blast that made men on nearby ships slap their hands over their ears and drop to the deck. The cargo ship seemed to disintegrate, its back broken, chunks of hull hurled into the air. "Dive! Dive! Dive!" the commander of U-99 screamed into the voice tube. His boat shuddered as it crash-dived, bow tipping down, ballast tanks flooding. Above, gunfire began to speckle the water as panicked gunners on merchantmen and escorts alike fired at anything they thought might be a U-boat silhouette. Below the surface, the world changed. On the destroyer, on the tankers, on the freighters, men dealt with fire, smoke, and chaos. In the U-boats, men dealt with pressure, darkness, and fear of what would come next. The moment a U-boat dove after a surface attack, the clock started ticking. Battery power limited how long they could stay submerged. Depth and hull strength limited how deep they could run. Most of all, the escorts limited how long they could live. In the control room of U-117, red lights cast faces in eerie glow. Water sloshed in the bilges as the boat angled down. "Tiefe, 50 Meter, 60, the helmsman called out, eyes on the depth gauge. Voss gripped a railing to steady himself. He could feel the change in the way the hull vibrated, the way loose items shifted. His ears popped once, then again. "Level off at 80, he ordered. "Silent running. Turn off all non-essential equipment." The chief engineer moved down the length of the control room, switching off fans, pumps, anything that made unnecessary noise. The boat grew quieter. The loud thud of the diesels had already been replaced by the softer, higher whine of the electric motors. Now even that seemed to fade into a low, distant hum. "Steer course 240, Voss said softly. "We will run under the convoy. They will look for us where we were, not where we will be." He could picture the escort ships above, circling like angry hornets, ASDIC pinging, depth charge racks full. They knew U-boats dove after attacking. What they didn't know yet was exactly where each one had gone. He intended to keep it that way. On HMS Ardent, the ASDIC operator pressed his headphones tight around his ears and frowned in concentration. He sat in a small, dark compartment lit only by the glow of the ASDIC display. The set sent out regular pings of sound into the water, listening for echoes bouncing off solid objects, like a submarine's hull. Ping. Silence. Ping. Silence. Then faintly a return. "Contact," he shouted. "Bearing red 10, range 1,800 yards and closing." Carr snapped around. "Mark bearing!" The helmsman swung the wheel, bringing the destroyer's bow toward the threat. Spray flew as the bow dug into a wave. "Depth charge crews, stand by," the captain ordered. "We'll run over him and drop a pattern. Corvettes to starboard and port, widen your search arcs. There may be more than one." He was right. There weren't just 1 or 2 submarines under that patch of burning sea. There were 6. Some were already slipping away. Some were trapped in the escort's net. One, U-99, had dived too late, too shallow, still close to where she had fired. As she passed 30 meters, her hydrophones picked up the rumble of the destroyer's propellers closing fast. "Incoming," the sound operator whispered, throat dry. The commander clenched his teeth. "Hard to starboard. Down to 100 meters. Schnell!" But it was too late to make it clean. The first depth charges rolled off HMS Ardent's stern rails with dull clunks. Minutes earlier, men had been sleeping. Now they were sweating and swearing, muscles straining as they shoved the 200-kilo canisters of TNT into position. "Set them for 75 meters, the depth charge officer had called. "We know they'll go deep, but they can't have reached 100 yet." Click, click. The depth settings were dialed in. Now, with the ship racing over the invisible contact, they pushed the charges into the racks and pulled the release levers. One by one, the canisters rolled off the stern into the black water, plopping into the wake and sinking fast. Y-guns on the quarterdeck hurled more depth charges out to either side with a thump, creating a pattern, a box of explosions designed to catch the submarine no matter which way it tried to dodge. On deck, the charges disappeared. Below on U-99, the men could hear them coming. They sounded at first like heavy footsteps far above, then like drums, then crushing thunder. The first exploded a little high and off to the side, a dull boom that shook the hull and made light bulbs swing. The second was closer, slamming a wall of water into the pressure hull, bolts creaking, gauges dancing. A third, lower and nearer still, threw men from their feet and burst pipes, sending jets of water spraying across panels. "Damage report!" the commander shouted, trying to stay calm as his boat bucked like a living thing. "Hull integrity holding," the chief engineer yelled back, clinging to a rail. "Minor leaks in forward compartment. No flooding." Another explosion. This one felt like a giant hand squeezing the submarine. Men clamped their jaws shut to keep their teeth from chattering. On some U-boats, under such bombardment, discipline broke. Men prayed, screamed, or sobbed. On U-99, they had drilled enough that most clung to their posts and focused on their tasks. But beneath the routines, fear curled like a fist around each heart. The depth charging went on for what felt like hours. In reality, it was minutes. HMS Ardent dropped one pattern, then turned and came back for another, trying to bracket the last known contact. The corvettes joined in, their own depth charge rails clanking. Their crews crouched as each explosion hammered through their thin hulls. The smell of burned cordite mixed with salt air. Then silence. The destroyer circled. Nothing. The Aztec operator called out that he'd lost the contact. Maybe the submarine had been destroyed. Maybe it had escaped past the edge of the pattern. In the control room of U-99, the commander listened to the fading thuds and made his own decision. "Hold depth at 120, he ordered. "Run silent for 1 hour. No changes in speed or course unless absolutely necessary." If they could just outweight the escort's patience, if they could creep away under the convoy, their odds went up dramatically. He wiped a smear of sweat and condensation from his forehead and tried not to think about whether the next groan of the hull would be the last. While the escorts hunted, the convoy bled. On the Skagerrak, Riley came to with his ears ringing and his face stinging from heat. The deck beneath him was listing sharply. Smoke stung his eyes. He coughed and pushed himself up. Flames licked across the deck just aft of him, pouring from a torn section of plating where the torpedo had hit. Oil ran in black rivers along the deck, catching fire in small pools. Somewhere, someone screamed, a high animal sound abruptly cut off. "Riley!" Joe's voice shouted, suddenly right beside him. "Get up! We've got to get off her!" He grabbed Riley's arm and hauled him to his feet. Riley staggered, head spinning, heart slamming in his chest. "Boats!" he croaked. Joe jerked his chin toward the starboard side. "That way, before the fire spreads." They stumbled along the canted deck, grabbing at handrails that were suddenly not where they were supposed to be. All around, men were running, some in life jackets, some barefoot, some half-dressed. An officer with a torn coat tried to shout orders, his voice almost lost in the roar of the fire. At the lifeboat station, chaos reigned. One boat had already been swung out and dropped, hitting the water crooked and nearly capsizing. Men clung to its sides, others floundered in the water, dark heads bobbing. Another boat's davit had been twisted by the blast. The boat jammed halfway down, hanging at a crazy angle as men tried to climb into it. Riley looked at the nightmare and felt his stomach drop. "We're not making it into those," he said hoarsely. Joe's eyes met his. "Then we jump," Joe said. "Off the port side, away from the oil." They scrambled to the other rail where the list of the ship had raised the hull higher above the sea. Below, the black water heaved, flecked with foam. Behind them, the glow of the burning spill turned the night into a grotesque dawn. Riley hesitated, then the ship shuddered again, a deep rolling shiver, and he felt the deck tilt further. "Now!" Joe shouted. They climbed the rail and leaped. For every U-boat captain watching his torpedoed target burn, there was a merchant sailor like Riley fighting for his life in the water. For the convoy as a whole, the losses began to add up. In the first 20 minutes of the attack, 6 ships were hit. 2 tankers, 2 freighters, a tramp steamer, and a small coastal vessel that had been added to the convoy late. 3 sank quickly, slipping under the waves within minutes, sterns rising like accusing fingers before they went. 3 burned, stubbornly afloat, steel twisting in the heat. The escorts faced a brutal choice. They had to hunt the U-boats to prevent more attacks. They also had to rescue survivors. There were not enough ships, not enough boats, not enough hands to do both perfectly. On HMS Ardent, the captain stared at the burning tanker and then turned his eyes back to the dark water where the U-boat contact had been. "We stay on the sub," he said quietly. "If we drive them off, we save more men in the long run. Signal the trawler. She's to pick up survivors as she can." Carr swallowed and nodded. He knew it was the right decision. He also knew that years from now he would still see faces in the water when he closed his eyes. By 4 in the morning, the attack had ebbed. The initial chaos of torpedo strikes and emergency turns had settled into a new, grim pattern. The convoy was smaller now. Instead of 40 ships, there were 34. 3 burned hulks had slipped beneath the waves, leaving only slicks of oil and clusters of lifeboats. 3 more cripples were being abandoned, their crews rowing away, hoping that the flames didn't reach whatever cargo lay hidden in their holds. The wolfpack had spent much of its torpedo ammunition. 2 of the 6 U-boats had taken depth charge beatings and slunk away, damaged. 4 remained in the area, keeping their distance, planning to shadow and perhaps strike again later at the next opportunity. For now, they watched the escort circle and weave around the convoy like angry bees. Below decks on U-117, Voss allowed his men to breathe a little easier. They had fired 4 torpedoes and scored at least 2 hits. They had evaded the first counterattack without damage. The men were exhausted. He was exhausted, but he knew the night wasn't really over. The Battle of the Atlantic rarely turned on a single attack. It was a slog. Weeks of hunting, attacks and counterattacks. Convoys lost, convoys saved. He checked his charts in the red-tinted light and plotted a new position, just ahead of where he projected the convoy would be by dawn. "We will surface at first light," he said, "and recharge batteries. Then we will decide whether to continue tracking. For now, silence." Men nodded and sank deeper into their bunks or seats, some closing their eyes, some staring at nothing. Above them, the Atlantic rolled on, indifferent. As the gray of dawn finally seeped into the sky, the full damage was visible. From the air, had there been an aircraft there to see it, the convoy would have looked like a wounded animal retreating, leaving a trail of blood. The intact ships plowed on, soot-streaked and grim. Behind them, patches of discolored water marked where ships had sunk. Areas where oil swirled, where debris floated, where an occasional lifeboat still sat waiting to be seen. The escort signal masts were busy, ton flags up and down, Aldous lamps flashing. On the trawler tasked with rescue, tired men hauled shivering survivors over the side, wrapped them in blankets and gave them tea that tasted of smoke and salt. Riley, teeth chattering, sat hunched on a bench, staring at nothing. He had watched the Skagerrak sink. He had seen men he knew disappear under the waves, pulled down by suction or weighed by their own boots. He had felt for a moment a rising panic that bordered on madness. Now, all he felt was a kind of numbness, "Lucky to be alive," someone said, beside him. He nodded automatically, though the word lucky felt obscene. Out on the horizon, black columns of smoke still rose where the other ships had died. On the destroyer, Carr stood by the rail and watched the same scene, his own face hollowed by fatigue. He had been up for almost 20 hours. His eyes burned. His ears still rang faintly from the thunder of depth charges. He knew they had done some things right. They had detected at least one U-boat before it could get right into the convoy's heart. They had driven away others. There were not 20 ships burning, as in some of the worst nights. There were only 6. But the numbers didn't comfort him. In the wardroom, there would be reports to write. In London, staff officers would tally those reports, plotting graphs of tonnage lost versus tonnage escorted. They would say, perhaps, that it had been a moderate loss. On the ground, or rather on the water, and it didn't feel moderate. It felt like being stalked through the dark by an enemy you could barely see and barely hurt. He thought of the U-boat crews, somewhere out there beyond the horizon. He tried briefly to imagine what it felt like to be one of them, pressed under the water in a steel tube, hunted. Then he pushed the thought away. He had his own ship and his own men to worry about. Back in his bunk on U-117, Voss lay on his side, listening to the familiar creaks and groans of his boat. He knew that statistically his chances of surviving the war were shrinking. At the beginning of the Battle of the Atlantic, U-boat crews had felt like the hunters. They sank ships in spectacular tallies, came home to bands and flowers and medals. By the time of this attack, the curve had bent. Allied aircraft ranged further and further into the Atlantic. Radar on ships and planes improved. HFDF, high-frequency direction finding, allowed the Allies to triangulate U-boat radio transmissions and vector escorts toward them. Escort groups grew more experienced and better coordinated. U-boats, once the terror of the seas, were now being destroyed at an accelerating rate. In some months, a third of the boats at sea never returned. Crews began to whisper about Schicksalsgemeinschaft, a community of fate. His own number would come up someday. It was only a question of when. Until then, he would do what he had been trained to do. Hunt, attack, escape. He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again as a petty officer ducked his head into the cramped officers' quarters. Herr Kaleun, we are at periscope depth. You wish to look? Voss swung his legs out of the bunk. Ja, let's take a look at our night's work. He raised the attack periscope slowly, the column of steel sliding upward with a soft hum. He pressed his eyes to the rubber cup and rotated the handle, sweeping the horizon. The image was still dim, morning's light weak and gray, but clearer than the blackness of night had been. There, thin columns of smoke, some dissipating, some still thick. There. The convoy smaller now, ships strung out a little, their formation ragged. He saw the destroyer. He saw the trawler, still lagging, busy with survivors. He saw no aircraft. Good. He lowered the periscope. We will not attack again, he said. The first watch officer raised an eyebrow. Herr Kaleun? We have done enough for one night, Voss said. We are low on torpedoes, the enemy is alert, and the escorts are angry. We will shadow for a while in case another boat wishes to coordinate. Then we will break off and look for easier prey. He could have tried for more. Squeezed in another attack, risked another dive under depth charges. Some commanders would have. But he could feel a subtle tiredness in his crew, in himself. There was a fine line between aggression and suicide. He intended, if he could, to see another dawn. As the day wore on, the Atlantic calmed slightly. The convoy reformed as best it could around its reduced core. Signal lamps flickered between ships. Somewhere to the west, a Catalina flying boat from a coastal command squadron took off from an airfield in Newfoundland. Its crew briefed on a rendezvous point with a convoy that had been attacked overnight. Another layer of protection was on its way. though the ocean was big and the aircraft slow. Back in London, in an operations room, women and men around a large plotting table moved small markers on a chart, each representing a convoy, a U-boat sighting, an escort group. News of the night's attack filtered in through coded signals. Number of ships sunk, probable number of U-boats attacking. Assessment: convoy mauled but not destroyed. On another wall, a chart recorded tonnage lost to U-boats that month. The line had once climbed steeply. Recently, it had started to dip. This attack would be a painful spike, but it would not reverse the trend. For the Allies, that was the cold, strategic reality. For the men who had been in the water, for the families who would get telegrams with phrases like "lost at sea" and "presumed drowned," strategy was cold comfort. Night would come again. Other convoys would sail. Other wolfpacks would gather. In some battles, the escorts would win, driving the U-boats off with no losses. In others, as on this night, 6 gray shadows would surface around one slow, vulnerable line of ships and turn the Atlantic black with fire. The Battle of the Atlantic was not one story, but thousands. Each night attack a separate nightmare, each convoy a separate gamble. This one was just a snapshot. 6 U-boats, 40 ships, 6 hours of fear, fire and thunder, 6 ships lost, hundreds of lives changed or ended. From the deck of a burning tanker, the night felt endless. From inside a diving U-boat, the seconds between a depth-charge splash and its explosion felt like years. From the plotting room in London, it was a handful of lines and numbers. From where we sit now, decades later, it is a chapter in a larger war. One raid among many in a long campaign to keep a lifeline across the sea open. But if you close your eyes and listen, you can still put yourself there. You hear the wind. You feel the pitch of the deck under your boots. You see far ahead a faint glow brightening, too bright, too fast, as a ship full of oil takes a torpedo in her side and the ocean itself seems to catch fire. You hear the shout, "U-boat! Torpedo track off the starboard bow!" You feel your heart lurch, and for a moment in that black Atlantic night, you understand what it meant to be hunted by 6 steel wolves beneath the waves.